Hello, welcome to episode 2 of Dancing with the Distance, the one in which I talk about CONELRAD, what it was, how it was supposed to work, and why it makes a really interesting way to think about emergency communication today. I'll get to that in a minute. First, hi, I'm Tammy, and as T.D. Walker, I have a couple of books of poems, and I just finished an 8-page poem, yes, 8 pages, that uses CONELRAD as a way of looking at crises, including the current pandemic. On a personal note, I just kicked said 8-page poem out to journals, and I'm hoping it will find a good home soon. I also just passed the 10,000 word mark on the first draft of a cozy mystery I'm currently working on, and I'm reading a lot of good stuff right now. I'm reading Louise Penny's Still Life, which I'm loving not just because it's set in fall in Quebec, which is a nice escape from the summer in Dallas, and I'm reading books of speculative poetry for the Elgin Award. I'm a member of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association, and the Elgins are the annual awards for books of poetry. I'll put a link to the list in the show notes. Full disclosure, I'm honored to say that both my books were nominated as well, and I'm just delighted that they're among such good company. Regarding radio, still working on getting programs together for shortwave short poems for November and December 2021 and for Postcard Panorama, which is still in the works for 2022. And I will talk about both of those shows next week. So on to CONELRAD. First, a little history. So back in the 1950s, the Cold War era, there was the threat of nuclear attack, of course, by the Soviet Union. People were building bomb shelters, fallout shelters, just in case of attack. So the question became, how do you tell people that the Soviets are coming? Tell people that you need to get into those shelters or whatever it was you needed to tell people to keep them safe in any sort of major emergency. Well, radio, right? But radio posed a problem, at least to the people who wanted to get out the emergency messages. If Soviet aircraft could lock on to one radio transmitter, then the thinking went, you were giving the enemy a really good way to find you. So for instance, say someone wanted to attack Houston and they knew there's a station there broadcasting on 740 kilohertz, which there is now and was then KTRH. And that means they could use that frequency to guide their aircraft to the right location. So to prevent that, all radio stations under the CONELRAD system would go silent for a few seconds, then certain stations would transmit on 640 kilohertz or 1240 kilohertz, where the triangles point to on the dial on radios from the 50s and 60s. Each transmitter in an area would play the message for a few minutes, then hand off the transmission to another area station that would take over. So it would be one station transmits for a few minutes and then hands off to a second and a third until they get back to that first one again. Basically, that meant all the radio stations across the country would be using those two frequencies, and the Soviets or whoever couldn't use any particular station frequency as a guide. The kinds of emergencies that CONELRAD was meant to be used for are entirely different in character and scope from the current pandemic, of course. A Soviet air attack on an American city would be, I would think, a one-off thing, a concentrated attack that would last a limited amount of time, and then it would be over. There would be the aftermath to contend with, but it wouldn't be like the protracted event the pandemic has become. If things shut down in March 2020, I think that puts us 16 months out or so. That's a long time. And yeah, using our current emergency alert system is entirely the wrong method of contacting people about what to do right now. But let's get back to CONELRAD. Let's step back and do a little thought experiment. Say you're in Houston in 1960 and the Soviets have launched an attack. There's the 1,000 hertz tone, the 5 seconds of silence, and you tune to one of your triangle markings on the dial. What would that have sounded like if you were maybe 50 miles or so from the center of the city? Given transmitter distances from listeners and transmitter distances from each other, I have to wonder whether, say, the first few minutes might be clearer, but the next few minutes might be less so. Would someone have missed something because they were just out of reach of the signal? And how detrimental might that have been, having missed that something? I would imagine that important details would have been repeated, of course, but what if the handoffs between stations didn't go as planned, for instance? All this is just a thought experiment, though, since CONELRAD was, thankfully, never needed for this sort of attack. Looking back to the CONELRAD era from more than half a century later, I have the advantage of seeing the technical questions through a technically advanced lens. That said, while I was working on the poem, I did wonder whether we needed, or still need really, something as ambitiously coordinated as CONELRAD was intended to be, to tell us to get into our bomb shelters at the beginning of the pandemic. Or, not bomb shelters, but go home as much as we could. Ultimately, CONELRAD was replaced in 1963 with the Emergency Broadcast System, which became the Emergency Alert System. I remember being freaked out as a kid by the Emergency Broadcasting System. Those tones, most often I'd hear them with the tests, but sometimes there would be a weather event in Houston where I lived then. But those instances were unexpected. I wasn't living then in the chronic state of vigilance that we're living in right now. The sort of vigilance that must have at some lower level gone on for years and years during the Cold War. Main point here, even if communication is expected on some level after a long period of vigilance, how much of a signal do we need to ensure that we're actually listening? So that's my take on CONELRAD, COVID, and communications. If the poem does find a home with a journal, I'll definitely let you know. Thanks for listening. Leave a comment if you have thoughts about CONELRAD or just crisis communication in general.